I want to talk to you tonight about something our own government is doing quietly, a piece at a time. They're not dropping the whole truth on us at once. They're releasing it in tranches. A hearing here, a report there, an admission that some of what's up there in the sky isn't ours and isn't anybody's we know of. Bit by bit, they're walking us towards something. And here's what comes in stages. First, they acknowledge it. Then they confirm it's real. Then they tell you where it's from. And somewhere down that road, maybe, just maybe, is the big one. The government of the United States standing at a podium and saying out loud, "We are not alone." Now sit with that for a second. Not the headline, the meaning of it. Because here's my concern. They may be handing us the biggest news in human history, without context, with no instructions, just here you go. No plan for what it does to a person, the mother explaining it to her children, the man whose faith just got tested, the folks already hanging on by a thread. And when you get a truth that size, with no way to hold it, you know what fills the gaps. Fear, rumor, people who will sell you a lie because they're scared, because they have larceny in their hearts. There are lots of motivations. That's the part that gets to me. We've got scientists at the table, generals, historians, astrophysicists. But the one expert who studies how a human being actually reacts to what happens in their life really needs to be in that room. And we need to make sure that that happens before the official word comes, not after. You don't chase something like this. You prepare for it in advance, because you cannot get ready for something like this once it's already landed on you. My guest tonight has been saying exactly that, and almost no one is listening, and there are reasons for that, and we're going to talk about it. Dr. Jennice Vilhauer is a clinical psychologist. She's taught at Emory, at UCLA, Columbia, and she is sounding an alarm, not to be an alarmist, not to be dramatic, but to be prepared. She's going to tell you who she believes is most at risk, why the truth matters less than how we are told it, and what all of us need to do to get ready. Because, quote, "we'll be fine," is just not a plan. So, Dr. Vilhauer, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for taking this topic seriously.
Well, I do take it seriously, and I'm not a Johnny-come-lately of this. I've been focused on it for a good while, and I'm a former skeptic, although I guess I would say an open skeptic. I'm always just kind of, let's look at the data. Let's see what's there. We've been through, I guess, 4 disclosures so far, 4 sets of information that have been put out. I think pretty cherry-picked, frankly, and I think all without context. What's been your reaction to the approach and to what's been released so far?
So I think that the government is giving information in a very slow way. I think that they are giving it without context, which I think is something that is a bit problematic. We know that people don't respond to information, they respond to how they interpret information. And without any guidance around how to interpret what's being released, I think that that leaves a lot of room for people to misinterpret and to have reactions that perhaps are not what we would want. So I do think there needs to be context. I think it's important to be skeptical. I think that we don't know yet what the UAP are. I actually sit on the UAP Science Council, and so we are looking at that very actively with some of the top scientists in the world right now. And we don't know what they are, but but we don't have to know what they are in order to realize that there's something there that we need to be preparing for.
I've heard you say something that I believe for a long time. Actually, it's this summer, I guess next month, that I'll have been in this field for 50 years. Probably noticed I have thinning hair. I'm willing to admit it. So I've been doing this a long time, and I've come to learn that people don't react to what happens in life. They react to what they say to themselves about what happens in their life. And most of what people know about this subject right now is fictional. Movies, stories, things like that have been identified as fictional. They weren't presented as fact, like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and that sort of thing. So we have a frame of reference that people kind of embrace and integrate. We have these images of alien life forms and things like that have just kind of become part of culture, pop culture. But if that's all that people have, and it is for the most part, the vast representation of what people have, that kind of represents their yardstick, their reference point. And what we've been given so far are grainy videos with white dots on a radar screen, and it's kind of hard to compete with the fictionalized versions. So I'm not sure people know exactly how to take that, and it kind of pales in comparison to what they've been given on the big screen.
Yeah, I think they have a fictionalized version of, what to imagine from movies and entertainment, as you've said. But I also think there's a manufactured fiction that is out there that our government has actually put out there. And that's not conspiracy theory. That's something that I know you yourself went through some of the government reports and actually showed that, they have been doing this for quite some time, really trying to, put out a narrative that there's nothing to see here. And I think that has also, it's not even that there's nothing to see here, but it's that, people who are in this or looking at this, or who, are making reports about UAPs are somehow not credible. And I think that has been a really unfortunate stereotype, but it's also created tremendous stigma that has not only impacted the way people perceive UAP and people who report UAP, but it's had a tremendous impact on our ability to study UAP. The academic world is quite terrified of this. It's not that they're not interested. There was actually a really interesting study done not that long ago that showed that a large number of academics are quite interested, but they do not want to study it because they're afraid of the stigma and the implications that will have on their careers.
If your retirement dropped 30% tomorrow, would you be ready? So many successful Americans turn to gold to help protect their retirement. And Preserve Gold is the only precious metals company I trust and recommend. Let me be frank, gold is not for everybody. And I do not give financial advice, but I do urge you to learn about a special offer to receive up to $20,000 in free gold and silver. Visit drphilgold.com. There was actually a study that I saw that people were asked if they would be less likely to vote for someone's tenure if they actively studied this than if they didn't. And a material percentage of faculty said, no, I would be less likely to vote for someone's tenure if they studied this kind of thing. And I know you, one of the things that you took exception to was my framing that there are people out there that I characterized as non-credible representatives, too drunk to fish, that tell these stories. And I stand by that characterization because I think that a significant portion of those that have been pushed out there are actually not by accident. I think there has been a psyop that's gone on where the most outrageous, non-credible folks have been pushed to the forefront of the media, so people that are credible hardworking, everyday people that have seen something are less likely to step up and report. Everyday Americans that, whether they're commercial pilots or farmers or linemen out away from city lights and things like that can see, get painted with a non-credible brush. And so people are saying, look, I don't want to be one of the tinfoil hat brigades, and have people think that way. And I think that's why researchers and psychologists are reluctant to embrace this and do research on it. There was a tabloid Weekly World News that I think for 20 or 30 years was devoted completely to putting out this kind of non-credible story. So there would be those that would say, oh my gosh, there's no way I'm going to talk about this because they're going to think I'm some kind of unstable individual. Some of the headlines from that tabloid: space alien backs Clinton, alien backs Obama for president, alien Bible found in Egypt, World War II bomber found on the moon, alien corpse found on Titanic wreck. Just these crazy sort of things that were put out there. So if somebody did see something, they go, I don't want to talk about it because, and I don't think that's an accident. I think if you go back and look at the Robertson panel, I think there was a distinct psyop put together so people wouldn't talk about this for fear of the stigma that went with it.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that it's created, stereotypes that, are perpetuated throughout our culture all of the time. I think Saturday Night Live had, 10 years ago, some of the skits about people who had observed. And, the thing about stereotypes is, there's something like a little bit in there always that makes it just enough reality that it feels like, somebody can latch onto it and say like, oh yes, that's really what it's like. But, the truth here is that the vast majority of people who are observing things are not reporting them. We have some research that shows it's about 5% of people who actually witness something are actually reporting. And that's because of fear. It's because of stigma. It's because they don't want to be placed into that stereotype. And so I think that that's something we have to change. And that's one of the things I think the field of psychology can help with. I think psychologists study stigma and how to reduce stigma, right? That's something they know how to do, but we have to get professionals on board and willing to stand up to the stigma.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And it does come at a high price sometimes. If you have a professional, if you have a scientist, and certainly I think there's an estimate out there that commercial pilots report this about 5% of the time, military pilots. And, when you have to get a medical, they're in a real catch-22 because if they report something, they can lose their medical because if the standard is, okay, there's nothing to see, so if you're seeing something, then you can be determined to be delusional. You can be hallucinating. You can be certainly just generally mentally unstable if you're seeing things that the examiner has made a judgment are not there. So how can we turn you loose with an aircraft with 300 people on it? We can't. On the other hand, if you have seen something and departure control also had something on their radar, and your co-pilot also saw something, and yet you say, no, I didn't see anything, and you sign that, now you've committed a felony because you have lied on your document when you file that. And then if they go cross-reference that with the departure control records and your co-pilot did say something, you're now in a catch-22. If you say, yes, I saw something, you can get grounded. If you deny it and sign it saying you didn't see anything, now you may have committed a felony and you can lose your ticket altogether. We've created a absolutely lose-lose scenario for people, but the posture is transparency and disclosure, but yet we still have a situation where we are muzzling those people that are trained observers with highly sophisticated technological observational instrumentation, and they can't talk about it. It's almost mind-blowing, the contradictions in the system that we're saying is transparent right now.
I mean, that's exactly right. And that's what contributes, the stigma continues because people aren't allowed to talk about it. And they are, and to the fact that the stigma is keeping people from, being able to talk about their experiences means that we don't have data, means we don't really know what's going on. It means that, we're really sort of going into this disclosure period very much in the dark. And we need to, fix some of these systemic issues in order to get people to be able to talk about things. I think they're trying. I think, little by little things are happening, but I think there's so much more that needs to be done.
Why do you think there's not more of an outcry for information right now?
I think that, that was actually one of my original questions when I first, because I'm, relatively, I would say, new to the whole UAP subject. But when I, first started to pay attention, my very first question was, why is no one talking about this, right? I actually published an article on Psychology Today and to try to really understand. And it was fascinating to me. I got, it got posted on a number of Reddit feeds and got, there were thousands of comments that I got to look at. And really, so many people were basically saying they don't care. They have other issues. They have to, worry about, paying their bills, the price of gas, the price of eggs, right? They have everyday real life issues to think about. And when you have so much, overload in just sort of daily survival, there's very little time to, speculate about things that aren't really personally relevant to them.
Well, you had a great graphic in a white paper you did. It was on page 8, what disclosure information runs into. And you listed a lot of things inside. It was so well done about what it runs into. Talk about that a little bit, because I think that was so comprehensive and so well done. And, one of the things that you put center stage was just everyday priorities.
Yeah. So, as I said before, right, information isn't what determines response. It's the way people interpret it. And one of the things we know as a psychologist, that I know as a psychologist, that the whole field of psychology understands, is that, the way that we process information is quite complex, right? There's belief systems that we hold. There are, ways that cognitive biases that we hold. There are, priorities that we have to, allocate attention to. We have limited attentional resources. We can't pay attention to everything that's out there. So there's, a number of different things that affect the way that people are going to perceive this information, which means there's going to be a tremendously wide spectrum of responses. We can't, imagine that everyone's going to respond in the same way. There's going to be tremendous variability. And that's something that we need to be thinking about as a country and paying attention to, because, some people are going to find this information to be something that they're engaged with, that they feel, is exciting and to know. Other people, at the other end of the spectrum are going to be afraid of the information. And we really need to think about those people.
You say real risk isn't panic, it's strain, and that most people adapt, but even if a small number of a huge population of 340 million people, whatever we have in the United States, reaching for help at once can exceed an already stretched system. And when we've got, for example, our young people right now, teens and preteens, we know that they're registering the highest levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness since records have been kept. I kind of think our smartphones and virtual living has contributed a lot to that. But we are stretched thin right now. And if you take even a small percentage of such a large population, we simply are not in a position to respond to that in a timely and quality fashion. That concerns me a lot. If you think about, and I worry about scam artists that are already out there, particularly preying on, for example, the elderly or the naive, and saying, okay, look, you need to get out of the urban areas, sell everything you have, and I'll sell you a school bus buried in the mountains where they won't come looking for you. I've just seen so many approaches to scamming these people. I really worry about that happening, as well as those that would be easily destabilized emotionally. We're not in a position to respond to that, are we?
Not right now. And that's something that we really need to be getting ready for. A disclosure event, if the government were to actually say something to the effect that, we're not alone on this planet or in the universe, that would be a global event, right? That information would travel so rapidly, it would go around the world. And, even a small number of people responding poorly could create, large public health crises. And that's something that nobody is preparing for at this stage, right? We haven't seen any government action to that effect. That's something that, we're working towards asking the government for. So I'm working with the Disclosure Foundation to put out a policy brief about, asking them to start preparing the nation. But that's something that we need other groups to be asking for as well. We need the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association. We need people who understand the impact that this could have on our population to really start to stand up and, demand that we get ready for this, because this isn't something that you wait and see what happens for. You can't wait and see. That's just too late. You have to prepare in advance. And, there are lots of things that we prepare for as, a society. There are many what we call, low frequency, high impact events, right? So things like pandemics or tornadoes or things like that we actually prepare for. That's why we have emergency management, systems. That's why we have, whole, FEMA exists. And we don't need to wait for an incident to happen. That's not a reasonable thing to do. We have enough information, I think, currently to actually recognize that there's something here that we need to be preparing for.
And the president of the APA right now is Dr. Wendy Williams from UC Davis. And when you look at research, like why psychology went quiet, a national survey of 1,460 faculty at 144 major research universities found curiosity outweighed skepticism in every discipline, yet fewer than 1% had ever done UAP research. And that was in Nature, Human and Social Sciences in 2023. And then in a 2024 follow-up, 28% said they might vote against a colleague's tenure for studying UAP. And so fear, not doubt, seems to keep people quiet. So if Dr. Williams took the APA and said, okay, we're going to throw resources behind this, what kind of headwinds might she be up against?
Well, you just said something really important, which is money is what starts to tear down stigma, right? If the NIH was to give money, or NIMH, to actually studying, UAP and stigma and, getting and preparing the nation, people would be more willing to jump on board. So I think, it has to start somehow from the top down, that there's a willingness to allow people to start, or give people funding and money to start doing this kind of research or preparation process. But, in absence of that, the stigma remains. But I think that enough people, right? So there's also power in numbers, right? So if enough people are willing to, sort of band together, and I think that's where the professional organizations come in, is really, starting to get their own members on board and talk about this. I think, there's something called pluralistic ignorance, right? Which is, we believe it's a form of psychological bias, but it's something where we believe that other people think differently than we do, right? So there was actually some research done called, and it ended up, they call it the cosmic closet, but basically so many people believe that UAP exists, that there are non-human intelligence out there, but there's a staggering difference between what they believe and what they believe other people believe. So there's a tendency to believe that other people think that this is, less serious than they do. And so then for that reason, they don't act. And so that's a big problem, right? And that's something, again, psychology is, the whole field is much more prepared to be able to help address this than I think any other field out there, which is why, I'm really advocating to get them to sort of pay attention and to get on board with this topic and helping people really break down the stigma that exists. Because without that, there's very little chance that we're going to make progress.
Clearly, it's going to take an existing infrastructure. This is not something that can be built from the ground up, because this is upon us. It's happening right now. And, the American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric Association, the American Medical Association, these are existing infrastructures which have emergency response arms and elements to them. And Dr. John White, who's the new head of the AMA, is a very dear friend of mine, and I feel it endemic upon myself to have a very heart-to-heart conversation with him about this from that standpoint. And I feel like I have an active dialogue with President Trump and the administration about this, and they have to do exactly what you're saying. They have to put their money where their mouth is. Disclosure is one thing, and I frankly am not at all convinced that we have transparency here. There's disclosure and there's disclosure. Mm-hmm. We have grainy videos of some things that we're not certainly clear as to what are. There are much better videos than what are being released. There's much more information than what's being released, but it has to have some context. Just the phenomenon that is being seen has to be put in context. You look at it, and I am convinced that we do have on camera and on reliable radar, as well as trained pilots and observers, have seen things that are not explainable with our technology. So these things, I think I don't know how to explain them, and we certainly don't have the technology to move at the speed that some of these are moving and turning in the radical maneuvers they're making. And there's more information about that than is being disclosed. People are asking me what I believe about this, and I believe that we need more context, is what I believe. And I think if they're serious about this, and I know President Trump is serious about this, they have to be willing to say, if this is going to be visited on people and it can change viewpoints on human exceptionalism, it can change viewpoints on religious beliefs and hierarchy, and it can cause people to wonder what are the intentions if, in fact, there is non-human intelligence, etc., that we need to be prepared to help people think through that and accommodate to that in their value system. And maybe you know of, but I don't know of anyone that has been through any particular training protocols to deal with those sort of answers, providing that kind of support or help. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get ready to do the work that needs to be done. And that takes time, and it takes money, and it takes a distribution system and a communication and education. And it's a monumental task to get ready to do what needs to be done. And even if it's a small percentage of a big number, that's a lot of people.
Yeah. Disclosure has been, a slow process. And I know people complain that, the data is not clear, the videos are not, easy to understand. But in some ways, I think that might not be the worst thing. I think right now, it's going to be a continuous process, a rolling process. I think right now we do have a window of opportunity here to actually start the preparation process. As you said, there's so much that needs to be done. Even if we were to mobilize, what existing mental health resources are out there, those people don't actually know how to respond to these types of issues in terms of, how people process UAP or all the sort of, particular different things that can come up as they're trying to understand this. There's what we call a clinical response gap, which there's been research done that shows that most mental health professionals don't feel comfortable addressing these issues. And so we really need to get them ready. So there is a window of opportunity here, but it's, one that we really need to take advantage of, because otherwise, it will be too late. Right now, we can avoid some harm, right? And I think that's what we would all want to do, and that's the right thing to do. But it does require action.
What do you think are the most important next steps?
So I think there are a few things, right, that are very, very important. So number one, there's a UAP Act in Congress that just went through the House that has a review board. It does not currently have a psychologist on board. I think that's one thing. I think that review board needs to be expanded to include, definitely psychologists, but also, perhaps some other disciplines that are going to be an integral part of, the preparedness plan. I think that, the professional organizations really need to start talking about this from the top down. I think that the government needs to recognize the need for preparation and really start to organize around that, right? There are many things, as you said, that need to happen. The good news is that there are many existing systems, right? We don't have to start from scratch. We just need to, start the plan and start talking about, what are the things that we need to do? There are some things like building training programs and that type of thing that, maybe we do need to do, but the vast majority of emergency management, can be utilized here, but it really does need to be activated, right? Like somebody up top needs to say, we need to do this.
Are you aware of any activity or even planning or existing committees within the American Psychological Association or American Psychiatric Association, for example, that are even exploratory committees on this right now? Is there any activity or action underway?
To my knowledge, no. That was something I sort of started back in January, trying, I wanted to, have a board set up. I'm currently working on putting together a task force initiative that, I'm hoping will gain some traction. But, what I've bumped into is that a lot of people don't want to talk about the subject. It's really interesting because there are a lot of people who don't even know about the subject, which is something I find, really surprising sometimes, right? Even people I talk to, doctors, lawyers, if I ask them about UAP, they seem to have no idea what I'm even talking about. And so I think there's, a real need to just increase the dialogue around this. I think, shows like what you're doing, very, very important. I think that's been a huge step. I think the rest of the media, needs to take this seriously and talk about it as well. But yeah, right now I don't know of any organization or anyone in this American Psychological Association that's really addressing this issue seriously.
Well, it's interesting because I will see occasionally somebody will talk about this on social media platforms or podcast or something, and it seems like the engagement is very high, but the distribution is very low. It doesn't travel to a high number of people, but those that do engage, there's a lot of talk and thought and conversation about it. But I do think there is interest beyond a core group, because I know I've put some things out about it, and it traveled to millions and millions of people in a very short period of time. So it wasn't just the core group of people that are kind of dedicated to this subject matter. And I do think there's an appetite, but not an urgency, as you've pointed out, I think very well. And I think that may be our friend right now, because you say if there's not a apparent and immediate relevancy, then there's not a high degree of urgency. And that may be buying us some time right now.
Right.
And I made some observations to the White House, and one of the things I said is we don't need a big event. We need pacing to put this out, to give people an opportunity to process and think this through. But I do think people are bothered by the fact they've been lied to and, in fact, misdirected about this. I think it's bothered them a lot. And one of the real frequent comments that I got back was, "Oh, Dr. Phil, it's a revelation to you that your government's been lying to you." That was a wake-up call to you. Come on. But at this level, yeah, I think it's bothersome that they've gone to this much trouble to lie and hide this much.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's hard for that to even penetrate a lot of people's minds, that the government could go through to this extent to try to hide something. I think that for many, people, they translate that into that must be a conspiracy theory. But I think the actual evidence is coming out. I think you did a really nice show about that. Yes, we have a window, and there's not a lot of urgency currently, but that window is going to close at some point. And the thing we have to also think about here is, uncontrolled disclosure, right? The United States is not the only group of people that has this information, right? Every other country around the world, well, the major countries around the world have this information as well. And so, that would be a much worse scenario, right? An uncontrolled disclosure where there's zero preparation and we don't know what information gets released, is likely to have much more negative impact on the population. And so we have to prepare for that as well. But the window is now, and I just think that we need to start taking action.
I do think more and more is going to be disclosed by the government. I think there's going to be disclosure from the private sector as well. And the fact that we don't know makes your point of getting ready for what may be something we need to deal with a top priority. And we do have organizations that have infrastructures that keep us from starting from zero. And we have to find a way to engage that. And you said the magic word, money. You got to follow the money and the funding. And I think that's something that we can have an impact on.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you were alluding to just a moment ago was, the way that the information gets communicated is just as important, if not more important, than the information itself, because that's what people are going to interpret. And that's something that the government can do right now, right? That it doesn't, they don't have to build any systems. They just have to, really strategize effective evidence-based communication. And that does not mean that they need to manipulate people and provide narratives that, are somehow, intended to manage people. I think people respond so much better to the truth and to uncertainty, as long as they feel that people are being honest, right? That's really the key here. But that said, we also know that there are ways to communicate that are effective and ways to communicate that are ineffective. I think no information is fairly ineffective, right? And so I do think that that's something that we can do, and that it's a very big, what I consider to be like a mediating factor in all of this in terms of the ultimate response is really, the communication and, how that affects institutional trust and how that affects the way people receive the information and ultimately affects our ability to be resilient.
We're out of time for today, and you and I have just barely scratched the surface. I hope we can continue this dialogue and maybe take some steps to help get some of these things done. And I'll bet you together we can move the needle.
Well, I would welcome the help and absolutely would love to continue the dialogue on this.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everything that you've added to this. Resilient isn't the same as ready, and that's the whole ask. Everybody, we will see you next time. Thank you for joining us. And don't forget, you can watch all new episodes of Dr. Phil on Envoy TV and Envoy Fast. Just go to envoytv.com for more information.